my initial interest in getting into neuroscience actually started because of my fear of death. So I actually had that first realization at the age of 5. I realized I was going to die. Wasn't really happy about that situation, but I thought, can I just keep my inner thoughts, right? Even if I don't have a body. So I asked my father the next day, where do my thoughts come from? And he said, they come from your brain. And I said, great, how? Because I want to figure out how to keep them when I die. You know, I was really looking for a soul. I wanted to have this idea that I can live on somewhere, at least my consciousness could live on. So that became my mission, to try to figure out how this 3-pound piece of matter creates all of our subjective states. Basically, again, motivated by a fear of death. So I began sort of looking, it led for my sort of search for life after death. I began to investigate what we know scientifically about the neural basis of out-of-body experiences, near-death experiences, which led me to an interest in psychedelic experiences and how they're tied to the brain, and finally, flow states. So I'm going to go through a couple of those. So, I mean, first in basically 1975, Norman Gershwin came up with this sort of constellation of symptoms that he found in people with temporal lobe epilepsy, that it seemed that they were having these sort of like religious types of experiences, these transcendent experiences, and that it was tied to having some sort of the focus of an epileptic seizure in the temporal lobe. And then in the 1980s, Michael Persinger came up with what he called the God helmet, which he could send a sort of weak electrical current to the temporal lobes, and it actually gave people these experiences, a subjective experience of sort of being outside themselves, or a sensed presence. That followed sort of more recently with studies that were done by Olive Blanque, where he could actually stimulate directly the temporal parietal junction in the brain and give people the out-of-body experiences. He also found that people were imagining themselves outside of their body, that he found there was activation in the temporal parietal junction. So he was starting to link these sort of subjective states of feeling otherworldly or outside of your body, transcendent experiences, to actually to changes in the brain. And then, of course, there are the near-death experiences, which people are associated with the feeling of peace. You know, they see themselves going through a tunnel. They have these amazing experiences that can be very transformative. Many people come out of near-death experiences with stories about how it shifted their perspective on life. And again, many of these subjective experiences, people are really experiencing them, but their explanation might not be the right explanation. It might not actually be that they're actually a soul leaving their body and having an experience, but we see that we can tie all those subjective states to brain function. And then interestingly, we find that DMT, which has been called the God molecule, which is the psychoactive substance in ayahuasca, actually gives people the same psychological phenomena as near-death experiences. So when you give them self-reports, they report those same kinds of experiences, otherworldly, outside of themselves. But really interesting, the main experiences that are both in near-death and when you have a simulated near-death experience with DMT is the dissolution of the ego. They really, you know, compared to placebo, they feel like they lose their sense of self. They have a mystical experience that is very, very profound. And then obviously we've been starting to use these drugs to treat psychiatric patients, but what's very interesting is that they can have one experience. They don't need to be taking it all the time like we do with normal sort of pharmacological drugs when we treat psychiatric illness. So it seems to be that what's fundamentally changing, the therapeutic effect is on their psychology. It's not necessarily the actual pharmacological effect. It's the experience that they're having, which is transformative, that's therapeutic. Now, we also see this with psilocybin. Again, people report having these otherworldly experiences, and it's profound. People who are given psilocybin who have terminal diagnosis of cancer, for example, trials show when they have extreme fear and anxiety about death, they do this once with it's psychotherapy assisted, and they no longer fear the death that's pretty imminent in this case. And there's studies that actually can look at what's happening in your brain when, for example, you're taking psilocybin. And there's actually unique areas of deactivation in the brain, particularly in the posterior cingulate cortex and the medial prefrontal cortex. And these are areas of the brain that are commonly referred to as the default mode network. That's your sort of internal reference and kind of your inner thought. and that's sort of decreased. So there's this, there's again an ego, your ego dissolves, and there's a feeling of this sort of oneness or connection with everything. It's as if your consciousness is expanding. And there seems to be something, again, very pleasurable about this experience, and it fundamentally shifts one's perspective. What's also interesting is that we see the same pattern of activation of decreased areas in the prefrontal cortex and in the posterior cingulate. Again, the default mode, not only with psilocybin, but you see the same kinds of deactivation during meditation. So I think there are ways that we can get to these states where we lose our sense of self, our sense of time and place, and we don't necessarily have to take it. I think drugs are sort of a shortcut to get there, but we can get there in other ways. And so what's happening in the brain? Well, we think that there's something to do with the release of the normal constraints. We need our brain and all this sort of random activation that's happening in the brain. We need there to be some constraints because it's adaptive so we can function in the everyday world and in a social environment. But sometimes it might be beneficial and therapeutic to release those constraints. So this is a sort of diagram that's looking at communication pathways in the brain. And we find that this is during placebo, and this is during psilocybin. So there seems to be freer communication pathways. There's hyperconnectivity of brain pathways that sort of expands, again, our awareness. And as Allison was talked about, this might be how a baby is experiencing the world. It's before all the constraints in the prefrontal cortex, which kind of suppresses all this random activation, has been put in place. And we also see this when we're using MEG, a different kind of technology, and this is actually some of work that came out of Neil's lab as well, and we can talk about it later, where it looks at, you can see higher signal diversity, which indicates there's a larger repertoire of physical brain states that could very plausibly underpin the specific psychedelic experience, and things like blending of the senses, dissolution of the ego, and basically you're seeing these networks that are sort of reorganizing themselves. And it's a kind of perceptual restructuring of the world and of the self. And finally, I want to talk about ketamine, because this has also this is not a psychedelic, this is a dissociative anesthetic, but it does give you feelings in low doses. In high doses, it gets used in pediatric anesthesiology, but in low doses, it gives you feelings of dissociation, of sort of leaving yourself. It can give hallucinations, but that doesn't tend to be the case. And as many of you know, this has been being really quite impactful in terms of the treatment of suicidality and depression. And I've seen it both in research and anecdotally with patients who had many suicide attempts, who were institutionalized, had been on every drug, tried ECT, nothing's worked, and they do these ketamine infusions, and it completely changes them. And so why is that working? Well, there are a couple of different theories. I mean, ketamine works on the glutamatergic system in the brain, but we think that the default mode can become sort of preoccupied, or you can start having ruminations that happen in people with depression. And it could be that the default mode in this case is sort of hijacked by parts of the brain that are involved in emotional thinking, like the medial prefrontal cortex, the anterior cingulate, and it results in their resting state becoming sort of consumed with negative emotions. And what we think is that ketamine might be disrupting the frontal control of the default mode network, and it could be sort of disconnecting the medial prefrontal cortex and the subgenual cingulate from the default mode network for a period of time, and that allows other parts of the brain to kind of take over that resting state. Because a lot of the problems and what leads to suicidality is they just cannot get out of this negative thought pattern, and perhaps the ketamine in some way breaks this pattern. So again, I think that these drugs, especially for psychiatric patients, are very important, have a very big impact. But I think people who are not having severe psychiatric illness can get to these states in many ways. As I said, one is psychedelic drugs, but there are other ways to get there. So one we find is meditation. Another, which was very interesting and kind of led me down a route of creativity, is when we're being in these flow states and when people are being spontaneously creative. We find a similar pattern of brain activation as you do with, for example, psilocybin when you're in these flow states. So I wanted to take a look at what's happening in the brain, and I had a great test subject, of course, my husband, Baba Brinkman. So I put him in the scanner, we looked at what was happening in his brain when he was doing freestyle rap, which is obviously an extreme flow state, compared to doing a memorized rap. And this was based on some preliminary data that came out of Liu's lab. But basically, it shows that when freestyle rapping, your brain actually enters a different state. You get decreased activation in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, increased activation in the medial prefrontal cortex. But that decreased dorsolateral prefrontal cortex activation, you lose your sense of self. Your ego dissolves. That's why a lot of artists say it feels like information is flowing through them. It's coming from someplace else. They don't feel like they're the agent of that. That also is the part of your brain that filters your behavior to make sure it conforms with social norms. That's released. So anything goes. You can make novel associations between ideas, and that's associated with creativity. And again, children, yes, they may be more impulsive, but they also tend to be more creative and think outside the box because these parts of the brain aren't fully developed yet. We also see the same pattern of activation with improvised jazz, so jazz musicians. And so it's really about getting to these flow states. How can we learn how to let go? And it could be rock climbing. It could be whatever works for you. And it's associated with a lack of focus, very positive emotions. And one question that I have in my research is there a neural signature of creativity? Does it cut across different art forms, right? What about painting, theater improv, comedy improv, dance improv? Can we identify the neural signature and then perhaps help people get to these states more easily and stay there for longer? And we also see similar patterns of activation when people are daydreaming, as I said, during meditation, and also REM sleep, where you have decreased prefrontal cortex, so that things are not very rational, they don't make sense, but sometimes we come up with our most creative ideas from our dreams. And it's also a way to access these unconscious processes that are normally being suppressed. It's sort of a release of the suppression. So I think finally what I think some of these experiences are giving us, and we're trying to understand it now, what is it about these experiences that are so transformative? And I think part of it has to do with this sense of awe, or this kind of what's been described as an emotion of self-transcendence. And in these senses, whether it's within a religious context or not, people tend to feel more connected, whether it's with a higher being, or with the universe, or with other people. And there's something very powerful in that feeling of connection, like you're not alone. And we were talking before, we're stuck inside these heads. But the more connected we can feel, that's very positive psychologically speaking. And the experience can be so profound that it can transform a person and give them a sort of new mission in life. And I liken it to the overview effect that astronauts have, when they first leave and they see the Earth from far away, and that really shifts their entire perspective for the rest of their life. So to sum up, I started out studying consciousness basically to find a way for my thoughts to survive death. And I didn't find that, unfortunately, but what I got instead was really a feeling of awe that of the range of, first of all, unanswered questions and perhaps unanswerable questions. And as I said, the material basis of consciousness is still not fully understood and may never be, but we're making big advances. But just the simple fact that this 3-pound piece of matter that organized itself in such a way, has the ability to make these advances, to continue asking these questions, fills me with awe. And as a scientist, I know there's no real evidence for disembodied consciousness or a soul. But as a human, I often feel that maybe it could be otherwise. My grandmother who passed away, I feel her presence in our house. I sometimes talk to her. I once was talking about her and the lights dimmed, and I thought, maybe she's chiming in. Now, as a scientist, I know there's a logical explanation for this. But as a human, I kind of feel happier believing that perhaps she's still with me, and I kind of allow the scientist in me. I have no desire to sort of undermine that happiness. And I think it's possible to know something with your scientific mind, that it's probably not true, but still believe with your intuition, and draw strength and comfort from that. And I think that's sort of part of the human condition, and that there's no real inherent conflict between these two states of mind, that there'll always be unanswered questions in science. And that's what makes science such a great endeavor. And the space left open by those questions is where my spiritual beliefs can be found. So thank you.